Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over Part 2, Chapter 3 of George Orwell's classic, 1984. Let's continue to see Julia and this love affair that's starting to form, shall we? This chapter picks up with Julia waking up after having sex and begins to put her clothes on, and she begins to act very businesslike. She then also gives Winston instructions on how to make his way home via a different path from whence he came. Winston realizes that she's very smart and cunning, and that she had a great deal of knowledge about the countryside around London, due to all the hikes that she's previously gone on. She also tells him never go home the same way you went out, and he takes this as an important general principle. She also tells Winston she will leave first, and that he has to wait half an hour before he leaves. She then named the place where they could meet after work 4 evenings from the current day. It was a street in one of the poor quarters where there was an open market, which was generally crowded and noisy. She tells him that if it's safe for them to talk, she would blow her nose when he approaches her, otherwise he was to walk right past her. She's about to leave the spot, and she asks him if there are any twigs in her hair, and that if she looks okay. After he reassures her, she says goodbye, gives him a quick kiss, and then leaves. Winston realizes that he doesn't know her address or her surname. Winston then mentions to the reader that during the rest of the month of May, it happened that they never went back to the clearing in the woods. He also says that the only other time they made love during this month was when they had met at a belfry of a ruined church in an almost deserted stretch of the country. He says an atomic bomb had fallen there 30 years previous, and that it was a good hiding spot once you got there, but getting there was very dangerous. He said the rest of the time they met only on the streets in different various places every evening, and never more than half an hour. He said that in the streets it was usually possible to talk after a fashion, and they drifted down the crowded pavements not quite abreast and never looking at one another. He said their conversations would be intermediate, like the beams of a lighthouse suddenly nipped into silence by the approach of a party member, or a uniform, or the appearance of a telescreen. They then would pick up the conversation mid-sentence a little bit later on when they were in a safer spot. Once they got to the end of their path, they would then split away and go home. Winston notices this type of conversation, and she calls it talking by installments, which she was really good at. She also was really good at speaking without moving her lips, and he also mentions that only once in almost a month of nightly meetings, they had managed to exchange a kiss. He says that when this happened, they were passing in silence down the street. Then there was a deafening roar, and the earth heaved up, and the air darkened, and Winston found himself lying on his side, bruised and terrified. He says a rocket bomb must have dropped nearby suddenly, and he became aware that Julia's face was only a few centimeters away from his own and deathly white. At first, he thinks she's dead, but then realizes that she's still alive, and the both of them are covered with plaster. Winston goes on to tell the reader that Winston worked 60 hours a week, and Julia was even longer, and that their free days varied according to the pressures of work, and often didn't coincide. He says that Julia seldom had an evening completely free, and she spent an astonishing amount of time attending lecture restorations, distributing the Junior Anti-Sex League pamphlets, and preparing banners for Hate Week. She said it paid off, though, because it was camouflage, and that if you kept the small rules, you could break the big ones. He also says that she introduced Winston to mortgage, and that he enrolled himself in part-time munition work, which was done voluntarily by zealous party members. So, once a week, Winston spent 4 hours of boredom screwing together small bits of metal in an illicit workshop, where the knocking of hammers mingled with the music of the telescreens. Winston says that when they met at the church tower, the gaps in their fragmentary conversations were all filled up. He says that that day it was a blazing afternoon, and that the air in the bells was hot and stagnant and smelled overpoweringly of pigeon poop. He said they sat and talked for hours on the dusty Twiddler floor. One or both of them would get up from time to time to make sure the coast was clear. Winston goes on to say that he then learns quite a bit about her. She's 26 years old, she lives in a hostel with 30 other girls, and she worked, as he had guessed, on the novel writing machine in the fiction department. She enjoyed her work, which was consistent of running and servicing a powerful but tricky electronic motor. She says that she was not clever, but was fond of using her hands and felt at home with machinery. She goes on to describe the whole process of composing a novel, from the great general directive issued by the planning committee down to the final touch-ups of the rewrite squad. But she said she wasn't interested in the finished product. She didn't care for reading. She thought of books just as a commodity that had been produced, like jams or bootlaces. She had no memory of anything before the early 60s, and the only other person who talked about the days before the revolution was a grandfather who had mysteriously disappeared when she was 8. She talks about all of her achievements in her life, from being captain of the hockey team to winning gymnastic trophies 2 years running. She had been a troop leader in the Spies and a branch secretary in the Youth League before joining the Junior Anti-Sex League. She also had done such a great job in the fiction department that she had been picked out to work in the porno sec. She says the nickname was called the Muck House by people who weren't in it. There, she spent a year helping produce booklets and sealed packets with titles like Spanking Stories or One Night in a Girl's School, and she said that most of the time this type of material was bought by parole youths who were under the impression that they were buying something illegal. Winston asks what these books are like, and she says, oh, they're just rubbish. They're boring, really, and they only have like 6 plots, but they're swapped out a bit and changed various ever so slightly. Winston also learns that all the workers in the porno sec were women. The reason for that being was because that the theory was men whose sexual instincts were less controllable than those of women, and they were in greater danger of being corrupted by the filth than women were. Julia says they don't even like married women in there. She says that girls are always supposed to be so pure, but then makes a mention of herself, who isn't. She tells Winston that her first love affair was when she was 16 with a party member who was 60. She also says that later he committed suicide to avoid arrest. And he did a pretty good job, because otherwise he'd have confessed and given them her name. She then continues with her story of all the different experiences she's had. Winston again notes that she had a hatred for the party, and said so very frequently. She made no general criticisms of it, except for it touched upon her own life. She had no interest in the party doctrine. She also had never heard of the Brotherhood and refused to believe in its existence, because she thinks that any kind of organized revolt against the party was bound to fail. And it struck her as stupid. The clever thing was to break the rules and stay alive at the same time. Winston wondered vaguely how many others were like her in the younger generations, people who had never grown up in the world of the revolution, not knowing anything else and not rebelling against its authority, but simply evading it like a rabbit dodges a dog. Winston knew he could never marry her because the committee would never sanction it, even if Catherine could be done away with. Julia asks about his wife, and he says she was pretty much the embodiment of the Newspeak word for good thinkful. She says that she doesn't know what that means, and he says that she was an orthodox person, incapable of thinking a bad thought. Julia says she doesn't know the word, but she does know the kind of person that he's describing. Winston begins telling her of his past married life, and of all the difficulties that he had with it, including the act of sex that his wife wanted. As he was talking to Julia about this, it was almost as if she could read his mind. Winston was very astonished to see that Julia knew so much about the relationship, or at least all of these different aspects of it. Julia tells Winston that none of this is new or special, and in fact, it was taught to women in the Junior Anti-Sex League. She also tells Winston that when you make love, you're using up energy, and afterwards you feel happy and don't give a damn for anything. And she said this is what the party hated most, because how else were they supposed to control people if not for a built-up, pent-up type of energy? Winston was baffled by this, but thought how very true it was. He said there was a direct, intimate connection between chastity and political orthodoxy. Winston also tells the reader the sex impulse was dangerous to the party, and the party had tuned it into account. He says they played some word tricks with the instinct of parenthood, how the party realized they could not actually abolish the family itself, and encourage parents to have a fond bond with their children in an old-fashioned way. However, the children were systematically turned against their parents and taught to spy on them and report them. So in essence, the family had become an effect or an extension of thought police. Winston's mind then goes back to Catherine, and he tells Julia of an instance 11 years prior when him and Catherine were on a walk with one of the committees. He tells her that they had lagged behind the group for only a minute or two, but as they continued to walk, they realized that they had somehow gotten off the path from the others, and soon they were at a very large quarry with a steep drop. Winston says that instantly Catherine began to feel nervous from being away from such a large group, but Winston really couldn't care. Instead, he was looking around at his surroundings and towards the edge of the quarry. There was a rock that had 2 different types of flowers growing on it. He noticed that each of the flowers were a different color and tells Catherine to come look at it. She does, but she also still feels very uneasy. So he grabs her by the waist and holds on to her. Julia interjected this and asks if he had thought about pushing her into the quarry. Winston responds he actually did have this thought, but in the end he ended up not doing it. Julia asks why he didn't take the chance when he had it, to simply push her in and do away with her. Winston tells her that some actions are not better than others, and that some victories really aren't victories at all. Julia asks if he's sorry that he didn't, and Winston responds that he is sorry that he didn't. He says that in the end it actually would have made no difference, and she asks him, why are you sorry you didn't do it? He responds that he prefers a positive to a negative, and he also says that in this game of life that they're playing, they can't win. When he says this, Julia kind of shudders away from him because she doesn't really like this type of thought that Winston has. Winston says that she would not accept the fact that the individual was always defeated. He says that she realized that she was doomed and that sooner or later the thought police would catch her and kill her, but another part of her mind wanted to believe that it was somehow possible for her to construct a secret world in which she could live as she chooses. He says that she did not understand there was no such thing as happiness, and the only victory lay in the far future when they were dead. He says that they are dead, and she says no, they're not. They are not dead yet. He says no, not physically, but 6 months from now, or a year, or 5, they would be. She asks him if he enjoys being alive, and she also asks him if he likes feeling. She then moves up close to him and says, I'm real, I'm solid, I'm alive. Don't you like this? He says that he does, and she says then he should stop talking about dying and listen. She then says that the next place they should meet should be at the place in the woods, given that it's been a while since they've been there. She gives him a whole different set of directions on how to get there, and she plans it all out for him. She grabs a small stick, and in the dust, she traces out the plan on the floor. This is where Part 2, Chapter 3 ends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, stay lit.